Some cases preoccupy people longer than others. The gruesome crime that took place in Upper Bavaria in 1922 still haunts people more than 100 years later. In recent years, the crime has been the basis for numerous film adaptations and literary publications. This case is one of the most famous German cases and continues to inspire analysis, theories, and discussion. Who murdered 6 people with a pickaxe on the night of April 1st, 1922, at the Hinterkaifeck farm? In today's video, we will analyze the Hinterkaifeck case and get to the bottom of this question. The Hinterkaifeck farm was built in 1863. Although its name suggests otherwise, the farm is not part of the municipality of Kaifeck. In fact, Hinterkaifeck is not the name of a village, but only the name of the farm. The farm has the unusual house number 27.5 and is located about 500 meters southwest of Gruber, in the middle of nowhere in the municipality of Wangen. Today, this area is part of the municipality of Weidhofen in the district of Neuburg-Schrobenhausen in Upper Bavaria. Hinterkaifeck consists of several buildings: a main house with an adjoining vegetable garden, a bakehouse, and a tool shed. The main house contains the family's living area with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a cellar, and an attic. The attic includes a smokehouse, a hayloft, and a threshing floor where grain is threshed. The living area leads into the stable, where pigs, chickens, and cows are kept. A rectangular wing houses the barn and a machine shed where grain and straw are stored, as well as some tools. A small hut adjoins the barn. The rest of the equipment is located in a large wood and tool shed on the property. Behind the main house is a bakehouse where the family bakes bread. The property is surrounded on 2 sides by a dense forest called Witch's Wood. But who are the inhabitants of Hinterkaifeck? In 1922, the Gabriel and Gruber families lived there, consisting of 64-year-old Andreas Gruber and his 72-year-old wife, Cecilia. Andreas is considered suspicious, rude, and stubborn. He is not easily unsettled by things and still calls the shots on the farm, even though he has long since left it to his daughter, Victoria. She also lives on the farm. Victoria Gabriel is 35 years old and known as a singer in the church choir for her beautiful voice. This is how she got her nickname, the Lark of Kaifeck. Victoria is widowed. Her husband, Carl Gabriel, died in 1914 during the first days of the war in France. She has a 7-year-old daughter, who is also named Cecilia, just like her mother, and who never got to know her father due to his early death. Cecilia is known to most people as Silly and attends 1st grade at the elementary school in Weidhofen. Victoria also has an illegitimate 2-year-old son named Joseph. As this will play a very important role in the course of the case, I will go into the circumstances in more detail in a moment and also explain who Joseph's father is or could be. The family is joined on the farm by their new maid, 44-year-old Maria Baumgartner. Maria has a slight mental disability and a walking disability that causes her to limp and entitles her to a disability card. March 31st, 1922, is her first day of work with the family, and before she can even start her job, she too loses her life in a horrific manner. Hinterkaifeck is isolated from other houses, which seems to suit its residents. The family is considered very reclusive by the other residents. They are estimated to be worth 100,000 marks, which is equivalent to about 500,000 US dollars today. They have invested some of their money in coins and jewelry, among other things, but their property is also worth a lot of money. They keep cattle, chickens, and pigs on their land, which they use to finance themselves. They often employ itinerant laborers for short periods of time. Although this is illegal at the time, it is also very inexpensive, and the family is known for being stingy and saving money wherever they can. In 1915, a scandal erupts when Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria are convicted of incest. Victoria is sentenced to 1 month in prison, and her father is sentenced to 1 year in a penitentiary. At that time, this was the type of prison where inmates had to perform hard physical labor. It is believed that the relationship between father and daughter had existed since Victoria was at least 16 years old. She herself is said to have stated that her father had emotionally abused her since she was a young teenager. Their relationship is described in many sources as consensual. However, it has never been conclusively clarified whether Victoria later gave her consent or whether she had been abused by her father for all those years. When Victoria's husband was killed in World War I, her father is said to have said, "My daughter doesn't need a man anymore. I'm here for her." As mentioned above, Victoria gave birth to her son Joseph in 1919. There are rumors that her own father is also the father of her son. Officially, the then mayor of Gruber and neighbor of the Lorenz family, Schlittenbauer, acknowledged paternity. Victoria is said to have already tried to seduce him when Lorenz was still married. In 1918, his wife died of cancer, and only a short time later he began an affair with Victoria. According to Lorenz, the two only slept together 5 times. When Victoria became pregnant, they wanted to get married. However, rumors spread in the community that Victoria only wanted to seduce him and marry him because she had already been pregnant before and wanted to present him as the father. If it came out that she was still in an incestuous relationship with her father, the punishment for her as a repeat offender would be much harsher. However, the wedding did not take place because of Victoria's father. Andreas Gruber was against his daughter marrying Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He does not want her to marry another man. In September 1919, Lorenz denies that he is Joseph's father and reports Andreas for blood libel. Andreas is remanded in custody. However, Lorenz withdraws his accusations shortly afterwards and acknowledges that he is Joseph's father after Victoria asks him to do so. However, he never pays child support for Joseph, as Victoria voluntarily waives her right to it in exchange for him acknowledging his paternity. At this point, the relationship between him and Victoria no longer exists. Sometime later, he denies paternity again and insists that Andreas is the real father. This time, however, the accusation is not pursued. In 1921, he marries another woman. Victoria and he no longer see each other, but the relationship between Lorenz and the Grubers seems to have normalized over time. The Gabriels and the Grubers continue their lives at Hinterkaifeck as normal. The months pass and nothing unusual happens. Until, at the beginning of 1922, several strange events suddenly occur. On March 26, 1922, Andreas Gruber makes a strange discovery. He finds a copy of the Munich newspaper near the farm. This is unusual, as no one in the immediate vicinity reads the newspaper. Nevertheless, he initially believes that the postman must have dropped a copy out of his bag. Later, however, it turns out that the postman does not deliver the Münchner Zeitung at all, as no one in the area subscribes to it. The family also reports that a man with a mustache has been standing at the edge of the forest for several days, watching the family's house. Andreas also misses his house key, which he cannot find despite extensive searches. On March 30th, Andreas notices a break-in. After failing to break into the door to the feed room, the person managed to break the padlock on the shed and gain access to the barn and stable. The person unties a cow but does not appear to steal anything. That morning, Andreas also discovers footprints in the snow leading to their house but not back away. At 11 a.m., Andreas meets his neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer and tells him about the events. Lawrence offers him his gun and recommends calling the police. But Andreas refuses, a decision that will cost him his life just a short time later. The family really starts to fear for their safety when they hear footsteps in the attic the following night. When Andreas goes to investigate, he cannot find anyone. Andreas and Victoria report this when they go shopping in Schrobenhausen the next morning. On March 31st, 7-year-old Cecilia reports a strange occurrence at school. She tells her friend that her mother ran into the woods last night after a violent argument. It was hours before she was found there. 33 years later, however, Cecilia's school friend changes her statement and says that Cecilia did not tell her about her mother Victoria at the time, but about her grandmother. Either way, this event is overshadowed shortly afterwards by something much worse. Less than 24 hours after Cecilia spoke to her school friend, she and her entire family are murdered. Maria Baumgartner arrives at Hinterkaifeck with her sister Franziska Schaefer at 4:30 p.m. on March 31st. The two have come on foot and got lost once along the way. Today is Maria's first day of work at Hinterkaifeck. The family's former maid, Christens Rieger, quit in September of last year because she said the farm was haunted. The door to her room kept opening by itself at night and she felt like she was being watched. Now Maria is to take her place. Several other maids had already quit after a short time because the work on the farm was hard and the pay was poor. Franziska leaves at around 5 p.m. Franziska later describes the situation as follows. Maria ran after me after I said goodbye, grabbed my right hand and didn't want to let go. It was as if she had a premonition. Franziska is the last person to see the family alive. Maria unpacks her things and the family spends a quiet evening at home. The last snow has just melted, but it is still cold outside and a strong storm is sweeping across the fields and the surrounding forest. Presumably, everyone in the house is glad that they don't have to leave the house that evening. Unbeknownst to them, a stranger gains access to their house. Between 7:30 and 9 p.m., this person allegedly unties a cow in the family's barn. It is believed that the untied animal makes noises that gradually lure the family members from the house to the barn. I will discuss this theory and some of the inconsistencies that accompany it in more detail later. According to reconstructions, Victoria is the first to enter the barn and goes through a connecting door into the adjacent barn. In the immediate vicinity of this door, she's attacked and killed with a hoe by an unknown assailant. Shortly afterwards, her mother Cecilia enters the room and is also killed. Andreas Gruber, who is the next to enter the barn, is also attacked and killed. Finally, 7-year-old Cecilia follows her family into the barn. She too is attacked with a hoe and struck dead. Unlike her family members, however, Cecilia initially survives the attack. Although her skull has been smashed in, she remains alive for at least 2 hours. In her death throes, she tears out several tufts of hair in pain, which are later found in her hands. Ultimately, however, she also succumbs to her injuries. It is not known how long it took for all 4 family members to enter the barn. However, reconstructions show that screams from the barn could not have been heard in the residential building, and it is therefore assumed that the victims went into the barn one by one because they wondered why the others were not coming back. However, there are other theories about the course of events, which I will discuss later. After committing the murders, the stranger enters the family's living quarters and encounters Maria Baumgartner in the maid's room. He kills her too, and then goes to the bedroom where Victoria and her children are sleeping. There, he finds 2-year-old Joseph lying in his pram. After the murderer has executed the 6 inhabitants of the farm, silence descends on Hinterkaifeck. One might assume that the perpetrator would now disappear as quickly and quietly as he came. But that is not the case. He seems to be in no hurry to leave Hinterkaifeck. The family's death initially goes unnoticed. On the night of the crime, a farmer on his way home at 3 a.m. sees two figures. The two unknown figures are said to have been standing at the edge of the forest, and when they noticed him, they allegedly turned away so that their faces could not be seen. On April 1st, little Cecilia is absent from school without excuse. Between noon and 2 p.m. that day, coffee merchants arrive at the farm to take the family's order. This was quite normal in those days, but there seems to be no one there. There is no response to their knocking and calling. As they walk around the house, they notice that the gate to the machine shed is open. However, they don't think anything of it and leave the farmyard. During the night, a carpenter passes by the farm. He has just finished his last job and is now making his way through the stormy night to his parents' farm. The only property he passes in the otherwise empty field is the Hinterkaifeck farm. He notices that smoke is coming from the bakehouse. What does that mean? That it's in use? Smoke is also coming from the chimney of the house. As he approaches the house, a man comes toward him and shines a flashlight in his face. The carpenter feels uncomfortable and quickly continues on his way home. But he also notices the glow of a second flashlight in the woods bordering the farmyard. So there were probably two people there that evening. On April 2nd, a Sunday, it is noticeable that the family is missing from church. Later, a man visits the farm to buy lard, but he too finds no one there. On Monday, Cecile is absent from school again. The postman delivers the newspaper. He sticks it in the kitchen window and is surprised that little Joseph is not sitting in his pram in the kitchen waving at him as usual. Through the window, he can see that the kitchen door is half open. Saturday's newspaper is still outside and has not been brought into the house by the family. With an uneasy feeling, he leaves the farm and continues on his way to work. On April 4th, Cecile is again absent from school without excuse. On this day, a repairman arrives at Hinterkaifeck at 9 a.m. He wants to replace the cylinder head gasket on the feed cutting machine. He has had to postpone his work several times in recent weeks due to bad weather, but today is finally the day. On his way there, he passes through Wangshan and meets the mayor, to whom he mentions his plans. When he arrives at the farm, he doesn't see anyone either. According to him, only the family dog is barking in the barn, and he can hear the cows in the stable. The repairman waits for an hour in the garden under a tree for the family to return home. Finally, unable and unwilling to wait any longer, he went into the machine shed and began to repair the engine. His work took a total of 4.5 hours. According to his own statement, he sang and whistled while he worked, and when he had finished, he ran the engine to test it and attract attention. When he is finished, he leaves the shed and closes the door behind him. He walks around the yard hoping to find someone from the family. According to his own statement, he sees the family dog chained up at the front door. He was very restless and did not stop barking. This surprises him, as he heard the dog barking in the barn when he arrived. He therefore assumes that someone from the family must have been in the yard in the meantime. However, the mechanic only made this statement when he was questioned years later, so it is possible that his memory is deceiving him. Nevertheless, his observations play a very important role, as the farm dog is a key element that I will discuss in more detail later. The mechanic also notes that the barn door is open, which was not the case when he arrived. He glances into the barn but does not enter it. At around 2:30 p.m., he leaves the farm again. On his way back through Gruber, he meets the daughters of the Schlittenbauer family who live next door. He informs them that he has repaired the engine, but that no one was at the farm. In Wangen, he also tells the mayor how strangely empty the farm seemed to him, and that he repaired the engine anyway. At 5:30 p.m., he sets off for home. The daughters go to their father, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, and tell him what the mechanic said. This worries him, so in the early afternoon of the same day, he sends his 16-year-old son, Johann, and his 9-year-old stepson, Josef, to Hinterkaifeck to check that everything is okay. The farm is about 250 meters from their home. When the two return at around 3:30 p.m. and report that they have not found anyone, Lorenz sets off for Hinterkaifeck himself. His sons accompany him, as do his two neighbors, Michael Pearl and Jakob Siegel. When the three arrive at the farm, the barn door is closed, which differs from the mechanic's later account. While the children wait outside, the three adult men enter the barn through the open door of the hut. The door to one part of the barn is locked and is broken open by the men. It is dark in the room, and when Lorenz climbs over a pile of hay, he bumps into something. Michael, who is following him, stumbles. He later describes the situation as follows. Schlittenbauer goes ahead toward the stable door. I see him stumble a little. I follow him closely and feel around with my feet because it is already quite dark. I bump into something and then say to the two men accompanying me, "There's something there." "It's a foot," one of the two men cries out. Schlittenbauer steps back a little and then grabs a foot that is visible. He pulls it further out, and they recognize the person as Andreas Gruber. The men take a closer look at the haystack. Under a layer of hay is a door, under which is another layer of hay, and underneath that are the four bodies of the family stacked on top of each other. While the other men leave the barn in shock, Lorenz, worried about his son, goes into the living area of the house. In the maid's room, he finds Maria's body, and when he enters Victoria's bedroom, he also finds little Joseph dead. Lorenz opens the front door to let the others in. The key he uses is the one that Andreas Gruber has been missing for several days. But more on that later. Over the years, many contradictions have come to light in the investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders. Witnesses have given conflicting statements, and the police investigation has revealed a number of gaps and errors. At this point, I will first describe the police's approach and the clues they found. In a later chapter, we will go into more detail about the investigative errors and the inconsistencies that arose. The police are alerted, and the first officers from Hohenwart arrive at Hinterkaifeck around 6 p.m. Word of the family murder has already spread throughout the village, and the police have their hands full keeping curious neighbors away from the farm and cordoning off the area. At 6:15 p.m., the Munich police receive a telephone report, and 6 officers set off for Hinterkaifeck. 2 of them are police dog handlers. The investigation is led by a Munich detective superintendent. They arrive at the mayor's house at 1:30 a.m. Since there is no electric light at the Hinterkaifeck farm and it is of little use to search the crime scene in the dark, they wait until 5:30 a.m. the next morning and then inspect the farm together with the court commission from Schrobenhausen. The court commission takes 5 pictures of the crime scene. 2 of the bodies in the barn, 1 of the dead maid, 1 of Josef's pram, and 1 of the farmyard itself. When Lorenz, Michael, and Jakob arrive at the farm, they find the family dog locked in the stable. The dog has been beaten and has swelling on its head and eye. This is particularly interesting in light of the statement made by the mechanic, who claims to have seen the dog chained to the front door just a few hours earlier. As he is not questioned until years later, no one notices this at the time. But what significance does this have for the course of events and the crime itself? As already mentioned, the farm dog could play a central role in the Hinterkaifeck case. To understand this better, we first need to take a closer look at how the Gabriel Gruber family lived with their dog. The family's golden Wolfspitz was kept on the farm as a guard dog during the day and locked in the barn at night. It was considered dangerous and prone to biting quickly. The family's former maid, Christens Riga, reports that the dog attacked her and bit little Cecilia on the cheek. However, it remains unclear why the dog was locked in the stable at night and not in the living area. At that time, it was common for dogs to be considered dirty, and only a few families allowed them to run freely in the house. But this separation also meant that the dog could not protect the family at night, as it could not reach the living quarters from the stable. Especially after the strange events prior to the murder, it would have been understandable to bring the dog into the house at night. It can be assumed that the family members did not do so because they were either afraid of being bitten or underestimated the danger and mistakenly assumed that they could handle it themselves. The family members were probably attacked in the barn. This also raises some questions, as the dog could have easily reached the barn. It can be assumed that if his owners had been attacked, he would have tried to defend them by barking and biting the attacker. Since it is assumed that at least the latter did not happen, the question arises as to whether the dog had already been locked up or injured at this point. An aggressive dog would probably not have allowed itself to be easily locked up or chained up without attacking the stranger. However, when Lorenz Schlittenbauer and the others find the bodies, the dog is so badly injured that it only whines and does not try to attack them. However, according to the mechanic, the dog had been standing outside the house uninjured just a few hours earlier, which would mean that the injury was inflicted only recently. It would also suggest that the perpetrator was still in the yard while the engine was being repaired and only injured the dog and took it to the barn afterwards. Other witnesses who passed by the farm in the days between the murder and the discovery of the bodies also reported hearing barking coming from the barn. The mechanic is certain that the barking initially came from the barn. This suggests that the perpetrator or perpetrators were still on the farm while the mechanic was doing his work, and that they let the dog out of the barn and later brought it back in. It is strange that the dog was injured in the end, but apparently obeyed the perpetrator's instructions without attacking him. This does not fit with the description of the dog as extremely aggressive towards strangers. Normally, it would probably have resisted and attacked the unknown person or persons. This leads to the assumption that the dog must have known the murderer well, which is why it did not attack him or raise the alarm when he entered the stable on the night of the crime. However, this theory is not pursued further, which is why it remains mere speculation to this day. During the initial investigation of the crime scene, a pot of burnt bread soup is still on the stove in the family's home. There are leftovers on the table. The family's tear-off calendar had not been torn off since March 31st, which again confirms that the murder probably took place the following night. There are several bloodstains in Victoria's bedroom. Joseph was killed with the hood of his pram. The pram was then covered with a red skirt by the perpetrator. There are also traces of blood in the hallway of the house. However, the traces are not secured and are not investigated further. Maria lies dead in her bed in the maid's room. After the murder, the perpetrator partially covered her body with the bedspread. She has several blows to the back of her head. The 4 victims in the barn were apparently also killed by blows to the head with the cleaver. Victoria and her mother, Cecilia Gruber, also show signs of strangulation. The investigators enter the attic, which extends throughout the house, stable, and barn. The floor is covered with hay, almost as if someone had deliberately spread it out to muffle their footsteps. We remember that Andreas and Victoria reported hearing footsteps in the attic just one night before their deaths. In 2 places, roof tiles have been moved so that it was possible to see the entire farmyard from there. It is believed that the perpetrator or perpetrators watched the family from there for several days before the crime. Another theory that is sometimes overlooked is the possibility that the perpetrator monitored the courtyard from there only after the crime to see exactly who was entering the yard and when. 2 hollows in a haystack indicate that 1 or 2 people were lying there at some point. The police dogs also alert the officers to the haystack and find human excrement. Traces of blood are also found in the attic, as well as a red handprint, which is unclear whether it is paint or blood. The investigators noticed that the perpetrator or perpetrators must have remained on the farm for some time after the crime, as the animals were reliably fed and watered throughout the day. This is a clear indication that someone must have been on the farm until the bodies were found. Later, it is noticed that parts of the supplies from the smokehouse are missing, including a freshly cut ham. The food leftovers found in the kitchen are often attributed to the family, but could just as easily have come from the perpetrators. This also fits with the observation made by the carpenter, who saw a fire in the bakehouse and smoke rising from the chimney, and saw a person with a flashlight on the property. The perpetrators may have used the fire in the bakehouse to burn bloody clothing or other evidence. This is also supported by the fact that he described the rising smoke as having an unpleasant smell. At the edge of the forest, the officers also find ashes and several cigarette butts. The first interviews begin that day in the kitchen of the house. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Michael Pearl, and Jakob Siegel, the three men who found the bodies, are questioned, as is Franziska Schaefer, the sister of the maid who was the last person to see the family alive. Later, Johann, the 16-year-old son of Lorenz Schlittenbauer, stated that he had witnessed an argument at the Weidhofen cemetery. Victoria Gabriel had been arguing with a man he did not know, who had harassed her and allegedly said, "Women like you never leave me alone." Victoria had then slapped the man and walked away. However, this statement is not investigated further, and after only 10 hours, the Munich Homicide Squad's investigation is closed. The investigators initially suspect robbery as the motive. Over the next few years, however, this theory becomes increasingly unlikely. Although the perpetrator or perpetrators had the opportunity and time to steal all of the family's money and valuables, almost everything was left behind in the house. Only a wallet in Victoria's bedroom was emptied. The cupboards there were also ransacked, but jewelry that was obviously lying around, other paper money, and numerous gold coins were left behind. This makes a robbery very unlikely. Was the perpetrator perhaps looking for something else in Victoria's bedroom? Johann's observations could indicate that the murderer had a personal motive and knew Victoria. The next day, April 6th, a doctor arrives at Hinterkaifeck to perform autopsies on the victims. He's accompanied by a law firm assistant. The autopsy is not performed according to regulations. 2 doctors should have been present. In addition, it takes place on a makeshift autopsy table, which they quickly construct themselves from an upturned door and 2 wooden trestles. There is no official autopsy report. Although a brief autopsy report is written, a complete report cannot be found later and was probably never written. The brief report only exists because the doctor telephoned the public prosecutor and the detective after the autopsy, and the 2 took notes during the phone call, which later became the official report. The fact that mistakes were made during the autopsy may be due to the fact that the doctor actually worked in a different field. He had worked as a psychiatrist for many years and had only learned how to perform autopsies a few weeks before the murder in a short course. So not only did he perform the autopsy without a second doctor, he was also not an expert in this field of medicine. On April 6th, Victoria and Cecilia Gabriel and Cecilia Gruber are autopsied. The following day, Andreas Gruber, Maria Baumgartner, and Joseph Gabriel are autopsied. It is determined that Cecilia Gabriel, as already mentioned, was the only one who did not die immediately and tore several tufts of hair from her head during a death struggle that lasted at least 2 hours. An injury to her neck does not match the others and could have been caused by a knife. When Victoria and Cecilia Gruber are examined, the doctor notices strangulation marks on them. There appear to be no classic defensive wounds, at least none are reported. This could have various meanings and may be an indication that the victims knew their killer. At this point in the autopsy, 2 murder weapons are suspected. The pickaxe cannot be found in the yard at this time. In the meantime, a pickaxe is suspected to be the second murder weapon. Lorenz Schlittenbauer lent this to Andreas Gruber. According to his own statement, when he found the bodies, he discovered the bloody pickaxe in the feed trough, took it out and placed it against the wall. It is later found there by the inspector. However, the pickaxe is not mentioned again, so it can be assumed that it either no longer played a role or disappeared. After the autopsy, the victims' heads are severed and sent to the Pathological Institute in Munich. There they are boiled to preserve them better and make the injuries to the skull more visible. At a later point, a séance is held with the skulls, during which two female mediums in Nuremberg attempt to contact the spirits of the deceased in order to identify the murderer. The prosecutor records the séance. One of the mediums describes the perpetrator as follows: "Has something shy about him, ugly laugh, even younger, furrows in his face, something piercing in his gaze, can disguise himself very well." Unsurprisingly, this method also proved unsuccessful. After the séance, all traces of the heads were lost. Today, no one knows where they are. They may have been added to the victims' graves at a later date, or they may have been returned to the Institute and lost there at some point during the Second World War. Years later, in 1953, the doctor's assistant reports a situation that greatly puzzled the two of them at the time. When they entered the attic after the autopsy to lay out the autopsied bodies, they discovered a rope stretching from the hayloft to the threshing floor. The threshing floor is where grain is threshed. They noticed the rope because it had apparently not been there the day before the autopsy. It is unclear how the rope got there in the meantime. Other investigators who searched the house earlier are not sure whether it had been there all along. Normally, a rope is not too unusual in this location, as it is often used to hoist hay into the hayloft. However, it could also have helped intruders to get into the attic and be a sign that the perpetrators remained at Hinterkaifeck until the end. Whether this rope played a role in the murder case remains unclear to this day. However, as it is often cited as evidence that strangers must have been in the attic, I didn't want to withhold this information from you. Since the investigators suspect a robbery, they initially suspect almost all beggars and peddlers in the area. Strangers and people with criminal records are also viewed with suspicion by the residents or directly considered to be the murderer. But all of the police's questioning and suspicions prove fruitless. On April 8th, the State Ministry of the Interior offers a reward of 100,000 marks for information leading to the arrest of the perpetrator or perpetrators. The police receive countless tips, but most of them are useless. Hundreds of farmers also arm themselves with tools and scythes and roam the surrounding forests in the hope of finding the murderer and collecting the money. But all their efforts are in vain. On the same day that the reward is announced, the deceased are laid in coffins and taken to Weidhofen. More than 1,000 guests attend their funeral, all of whom have heard about the gruesome crime and want to pay their respects. After a dispute over the inheritance between the Gruber and Gabriel families, the family of the deceased Karl Gabriel buys the Hinterkaifeck farm from the community of heirs for 3 million marks. Since no one wants to live in the house where the gruesome sixfold murder took place, they decide to tear down the building. The public prosecutor's office agrees, even though the chief inspector says that this will ruin any chance of authentically reconstructing the crime in the future. In February 1923, Karl Gabriel Sr., the father of Victoria's deceased husband, demolishes the Hinterkaifeck farm together with his sons and some neighbors. They begin by prying up the floorboards in the attic, a so-called false floor. Under the boards, they find the pickaxe that was used to kill the victims. It has dried blood, women's hair, and tissue remnants on it. Among other boards, they also find a rusty pocket knife. However, it is unclear whether this has anything to do with the crime, as Andreas Gruber also owned a pocket knife and lost it at some point. It could therefore either be his missing pocket knife or another murder weapon. In any case, the notes made during the autopsy state that a wound on little Cecilia's neck could also have been caused by a knife. The pickaxe used to commit the murders is examined for fingerprints, but to no avail. It had belonged to the family for many years. This is later confirmed by Georg Siegel, a former farmhand of the family. It is homemade and has a screw sticking out. This makes it possible to identify it as the murder weapon without a doubt, as the protruding screw left injuries on the victims. After the pickaxe is found, No new investigations are launched, and the demolition of the farm is not stopped. This means that further clues may be lost. During the demolition, a bloody iron band is also found. It is made of flat steel and is used to secure heavy objects, repair tools, or for fittings of any kind. This iron band is not mentioned again later. While the murder weapon is known, it is possible that a pocket knife, an iron band, and the pickaxe found by Lorenz Schlittenbauer in the stable at the time could also be murder weapons. However, little attention is paid to the other objects, and they are not investigated further. This is despite the fact that the autopsy mentions 2 murder weapons. And that brings us to the investigative errors and inconsistencies. We will discuss these in the next chapter, and there are quite a few of them. I have already touched on some of the possible investigative errors in the previous chapter. In this chapter, I would like to go into more detail about investigative errors and inconsistencies, as well as pointing out clues that have not yet been mentioned. Some of the investigative errors can be interpreted in different ways. Nevertheless, I will list them here so that you can form your own opinion. For example, it can already be considered an investigative error that, after the hoe, pocket knife, and band iron were found, the demolition of the courtyard was allowed to proceed without further investigation. It is also striking that many reports refer only to the hoe as the murder weapon, even though the other blood-stained objects and the pocket knife could never be ruled out as murder weapons. The first report of the discovery explicitly mentions the pickaxe found by Lorenz Schlittenbauer and lists it as a murder weapon. However, there is no further mention of it after the hoe was found. It would be extremely relevant to know what the victims were killed with. Multiple weapons would be a strong indication that there were several perpetrators. The alleged sequence of events also raises questions. Officially, it is said that the perpetrator or perpetrators untied one of the cows, and that the family members were gradually lured into the barn by the noise of the animal. However, when the scene was later reconstructed, it was determined that the screams of the family members could not have been heard from the barn to the house. This naturally raises the question of why they should have been able to hear the cow and whether there might have been another reason why the family members entered the barn one after the other. Or did she not do that at all? For several years, a theory has been circulating on the internet that the barn was not the scene of the crime at all, but that the perpetrators waited in the attic for the right moment and surprised the family in the living area. This would also explain the bloodstains in the attic and living area, which were never investigated in depth. A bloody shoe print was also found in the living area, which the perpetrator could have left behind during the crime. If this is what happened, then the barn would only have been used to store the bodies. However, this would also mean that the actual order in which the victims were attacked and killed is unknown, as a completely different sequence of events would also be possible. This theory is also supported by the fact that there was no light in the barn, and that the attack on the family members must have taken place in complete darkness. Even if there had been several perpetrators and one of them had been carrying a flashlight, it would not have been easy to aim for the victims' heads in the near darkness. If the family had been killed in their home instead, this would also explain why their dog did not warn them by barking or attack the perpetrator. Criticism has also been leveled at the fact that so few photos were taken of the crime scene. The bloodstains in the house were not photographed at all, and the evidence presented is otherwise very sketchy. In addition, the investigators moved the bodies back to their original positions for one of their photos because Lorenz Schlittenbauer and the 2 other men who found the family had moved them. This means that this well-known image is not actually a valid piece of evidence, as it shows a staged crime scene. Apart from the photos, no traces were secured at all. No fingerprints were taken, even though this would have been possible with the technology available at the time. The attic, the human excrement found there, and the hollows in the hay could also have been examined more closely. It is strange that Andreas Gruber apparently did not notice them when he searched the attic just hours before the crime. This supports the theory that he regularly slept there with his daughter Victoria, and that the hollows in the hay may not have been made by strangers, but by them. Investigators have also determined that the crime took place between 8 and 11 p.m. However, it seems likely that the crime occurred somewhat earlier. All of the victims were still wearing the clothes and shoes they had worn that day when they died. In 1922, many families went to bed early or at least changed into their nightclothes early. In addition, the new maid, Marie Baumgartner, was still busy unpacking her belongings at the time of the crime. These clues reinforce the theory that it cannot have been too late when the attack took place. The police's handling of witness statements is also criticized. The carpenter tells them what he saw. He not only reports that smoke was coming from the bakehouse, but also that it smelled awful. So it's very likely that the perpetrator wasn't baking bread there. If his statement had been followed up immediately, it might have been possible to find out what had been burned in the bakehouse in the days after the crime. Instead, this and most other witness statements are ignored and not investigated further. The statements made by the mechanic also suggest that the perpetrator was still in the yard on April 4th and probably only fled after the mechanic left. But this theory is not pursued either. In general, the personal environment of the victims is hardly examined in detail, although there are many indications of a personal motive for the murder. It is suspected that the crime may have something to do with the maid Maria, as she started working on the farm on that very day. It might have been possible to shed some light on the case if her environment had been investigated more thoroughly. But this never happened. The police also cling to robbery as a motive for a long time, even though there is a lot to contradict this theory. No valuable items were stolen from the house. The family kept a large amount of money in a cupboard, and evidence suggests that the perpetrator or perpetrators opened and ransacked the cupboard while they were still in the house after the crime. However, they did not pay any attention to the money. Furthermore, the extremely violent nature of the murder suggests a personal motive and a relationship between the victims and the perpetrator or perpetrators. In 2007, a project was launched in Bavaria in which 15 police cadets re-examined the case for a study project. They made the following findings. The victims were all covered. This suggests that the perpetrator knew the victims and wanted some kind of retribution. In May 1927, a man is said to have stopped a resident of Weidhofen around midnight. He is said to have first asked him questions about the crime and then shouted that he was the murderer. He then ran into the forest. The man was never found. It remains unclear whether he actually had anything to do with the crime or whether it was simply a morbid joke. In the 1970s, the sacristy of St. Vitus Church in Hagelstadt was demolished. During the demolition, a family death notice was found in a church register. This tradition has existed since the 17th century. A death notice or obituary card is usually a card or folded piece of paper intended to commemorate the deceased and distributed at funerals. The Gabriel Gruber family's death notice, which was found in St. Vitus Church, contains a picture of the family and some dates, as well as additional handwritten notes. It reads, "Envious, usurious, despised by all, 1 year for immorality, incest, and God's punishment." It is believed that the death notice was written in 1920. However, it remains unclear who wrote it and how it ended up in St. Vitus Church in Hagelstadt, some 85 kilometers away. The current owner of the death picture has done a lot of research, but has never been able to find out how it got there. However, he has learned that the handwritten notes were most likely written in Gabelsberger shorthand, a font that was only mastered by scholars, clergy, or teachers at the time. Another strange event connected with the church concerns a pastor from Weidhofen. He claims that 2 weeks before the crime, he found a bag containing 700 gold marks in one of the confessionals. This was a very large sum at the time, exceeding the wealth of most families. The priest stated that he knew immediately that only one family in the area had that much money: the Gabriel Grubers. He spoke to Victoria's daughter Cecilia about it at school, and asked her to bring Victoria to the church. When she does so, he asks her about the money, and according to his statement, after some hesitation, she admits that the money is hers and is a donation for the church's missionary work. It is unclear whether there is more behind this donation and whether it really came from Victoria Gabriel. However, it is known that Victoria closed several savings accounts before the crime. Whether she spent the money and what she spent it on has never been clarified. But given these circumstances, some people suspect that Victoria must have known something that never came to light. The pastor also gave a sermon at the family's funeral in front of over 1,000 guests. It must be remembered that in 1922, religion and faith played a much greater role in society than is the case today. At that time, there were very few people who did not believe in God, or at least did not express their beliefs publicly. If the murderer of the family came from nearby, it is therefore quite likely that he also attended the church in Weidhofen. The pastor seems to share this assumption, as he states that the murderers should be sought among the guests at the funeral. He adds that the murderer is no longer alive, having died in 1931. However, he never gets any more specific and, when asked, refers to the confidentiality of confession. In the meantime, there is talk of a letter from the Vatican that would release the priest from his duty of confidentiality, but this never happens. But his statement implies that the perpetrator allegedly confessed his crime to him. This only narrows down the circle of suspects to a limited extent, as already mentioned, almost everyone went to church at that time, and there were more than 1,000 guests at the funeral. However, the fact that the murderer was already dead in 1931 greatly reduces the number of suspects. Of course, the pastor's statement could also be a lie, or someone may have confessed to him a crime they never actually committed. Nevertheless, we can keep his statements in mind when we look at the suspects in the next chapter. The police investigation eventually comes to nothing, and the hope of finding the murderer or murderers of the 6 residents of the farmstead fades with each passing year. Over time, around 100 suspects have emerged who could be responsible for the murders. The large reward offered for information led many people to report their own friends or family members to the police in order to receive the money. Others confessed to the crime on their deathbeds in the hope that their relatives would receive the reward. It is extremely difficult for the police to find genuine leads among the many false confessions and tips. Officially, no one can ever be charged and convicted of the sixfold murder. However, there are individuals who are suspected and cannot be ruled out as perpetrators. Some of them have been suspected by the police themselves over the years, while others have been identified as suspects by local residents or through literature and the internet. In the following, I would like to introduce some of them to you. Form your own opinion about which of them you think could be the perpetrator. Crestson's Riga, the family's former maid, considers 2 possibilities for the murder of the family. On the one hand, she suspects the Bichler brothers and Georg Siegel, and on the other hand, the Zahler brothers, whom I will discuss in more detail below. Anton Bichler had helped with the potato harvest, and therefore knew his way around the farm. In Crestson's presence, he often commented on the Gruber's unfriendly manner. Later, she learned from an old woman that Anton Bichler had said that the Hinterkaifeckers should all be killed. In her statement, Crestsson also emphasizes that the family's farm dog barked at and attacked all strangers. Everyone except Anton. She is convinced that the dog would only have allowed someone it knew to put it on a leash without barking or resisting. She also reports that one night, a stranger stood outside her window and left the property after a brief exchange of words. Crestsson believes that the man could have been Karl Bichler, Anton's brother. She also states that she could imagine that the 2 brothers could have committed the murder together with Georg Siegel. a former farmhand of the family. Georg knew the farm buildings well and, according to Crestsons, was interested in the family's money. He is said to have stolen from the farm once before in November 1920. Despite these allegations, he worked again for a few days as a farmhand at Hinterkaifeck in September 1921. Georg Siegel himself denies both the theft and the murder, and neither he nor the Bichler brothers are arrested. The other brothers suspected by Crestsons are the Thaler brothers. According to her statement, the brothers had already committed several burglaries in the area. In 1921, Josef Thaler allegedly stood outside her window several times at night and tried to pry information about the family from her. However, she never gave him any information. One evening when he left, she saw a second person nearby. Crestsons suspects that this could have been his brother Andreas. According to Crestsons, when the two left, they looked at the machine house and up at the roof, possibly in the direction of the attic. Josef is said to have known that the family had a lot of money and who slept in which room. But these suspects were not investigated further either. However, since robbery and murder are now considered highly unlikely, Crestsons' theories have also become increasingly improbable over time. At the time of the crime, brothers Karl and Andreas Schreier are 23 and 31 years old and come from Saddleberg. They are feared in the area for their violence and aggressiveness. Andreas, a day laborer, often works in different places. Around the time of the crime, the brothers are busy hauling wood from a nearby forest. Since their route passed by the Hinterkaifeck farm, they could have easily spied on the family. This fact led to them coming under suspicion and being arrested on August 3, 1922. However, since they were able to provide an alibi for the time of the crime, they were released shortly thereafter, and the investigation against them was dropped. In 1971, they came under suspicion again after a woman named Teresa T. wrote a letter describing an event from her youth. According to her statement, Karl and Andreas's mother had told her mother at the time that her sons had committed the murder. She claimed to have heard her say that one of her sons had lost his pocket knife. This would fit with the pocket knife found in the attic when the Hinterkaifeck house was demolished. At the time, only a few people knew about the discovery of the knife, which makes it a very important piece of information. As already mentioned, Andreas Gruber also owned a pocket knife that was lost some time before the crime. So the knife found could, of course, have been his. Karl and Andreas Schreier have since died, and the investigation against them has not been reopened due to their alibis. Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who is said to have been killed in World War I, is also repeatedly mentioned as a possible suspect. It is speculated that he did not actually die in the war, but exchanged his identity with another soldier who was killed. The marriage between him and Victoria is said to have been unhappy even before the war. The theory is that he returned to the farm, discovered that Victoria had had another child with another man, possibly even her own father, and in his rage killed the entire family. This could also explain the additional strangulation marks on Victoria's neck. This theory is supported by reports that some people claim to have encountered Karl Gabriel somewhere in the years after the murder. After the end of World War II, there were numerous independent reports from war veterans who claimed to have met a Bavarian-speaking Soviet officer who claimed to be the Hinterkaifeck murderer. Some later retracted their statements, but even if some of them were true, that does not necessarily mean that the officer was actually Karl Gabriel. This theory seems rather unlikely, as several witnesses who knew Karl Gabriel for years and were with him in the war were able to testify to his death. A school friend was also later able to identify his body beyond any doubt, which means that there should be no realistic doubts about his death. Lorenz Schlittenbauer served in World War I and has suffered from the consequences ever since. He has headaches and asthma, which limit his ability to work as a farmer. With his black mustache and angular face, he often stands out from the crowd. Even back then, he quickly became one of the main suspects. Living only 350 meters from Hinterkaifeck and knowing both the residents and the farm very well, he could easily have learned their habits and known how to gain access to the house. Since one of his fields borders Hinterkaifeck, no one would have been surprised to see him often near the farm. When Schlittenbauer sets off for Hinterkaifeck with the two other men to check on the situation, he says, "There's no movement. Either they've all hanged themselves or been beaten to death." A statement that later makes him look very suspicious in the eyes of many people. While the other two men leave the stable in shock after finding the bodies of the family together with Lorenz Schlittenbauer, he continues purposefully into the house. This gives him the opportunity to cover up traces or leave new ones unseen. Things become particularly strange when Lorenz unlocks the front door with a key to let the other two men in. The key is Andreas Gruber's key, which has been missing without a trace for several days. Lorenz claims that the key was already in the door. However, since the family searched the entire farm for the key in the days before their death, it is very unlikely that they overlooked it in the front door. There are therefore two possibilities that come to mind. Either Lorenz Schlittenbauer had the key in his pocket because he committed the crime and forgot that no one must notice that he was in possession of the key, or a stranger stole the key from Andreas Gruber in the days before the crime in order to gain access to the house unnoticed in the near future. When the perpetrator was surprised by the repairman and hurriedly left the yard, he left the key in the door lock because he either forgot it there or simply no longer needed it and did not want to be caught with the key later. In my opinion, this information alone is not sufficient to prove Lorenz Schlittenbauer's guilt. Over the years, however, there have been more strange occurrences that suggest he may have had something to do with the crime. The suspicions against Lorenz Schlittenbauer are reinforced by two further incidents. Firstly, it is reported that after the murders, he often spoke about the perpetrator in the first person at the local pub. This could indicate that he has inside knowledge of the crime and may even be the perpetrator himself. Secondly, in 1925, there was a strange encounter between Lorenz Schlittenbauer and the then court teacher Hans Eblager on the grounds of Hinterkaifeck, where the farm had already been demolished. Hans Eblager sees Lorenz Schlittenbauer standing bent over the cellar entrance and speaks to him. Lorenz reacts with alarm and tells him about an alleged attempt by the perpetrator to bury the bodies, which was unsuccessful. This information had not been reported by anyone before and could be interpreted as knowledge possessed by the perpetrator. If his statement is true, Lorenz Schlittenbauer could only have known these details if he himself was the murderer. In 1926, another strange event occurred. A fire broke out on the Schlittenbauer family estate, destroying several documents, including some related to Hinterkaifeck. Among them are papers in which Victoria stated that she was waiving her right to child support for her son Josef. During Lorenz Schlittenbauer's interrogation, he stated the following: "I had known the Gruber family from Hinterkaifeck since I was born. The Grubers had several children, but only one daughter, Victoria, survived. The children probably all died because they were neglected and not fed enough. My father and I often saw the small children being kept in the cellar for days on end, and when we passed by, we could hear them crying. I'll be honest, they weren't good people. God had his hand in this. Victoria Gruber, who later married Carl Gabriel, was 13 years younger than me. Of course, I had known her since she was a child, but I didn't get to know her better until she was already a widow. It was common knowledge that old Gruber had slept with his daughter. The old Gruber woman didn't talk about it, but her daughter Victoria, who was 16 at the time, did. She told my first wife that she couldn't stand her father anymore because he always wanted to have intercourse. Victoria was very promiscuous. Soon after her husband's death, I helped her move a cupboard. We were driving in my wagon, and she offered herself to me right away. She said, 'You could easily take me now.' but I didn't go along with it at the time because I was still married. After my wife died, Victoria came to me in the hay barn one day, waited for me there, and suggested that I marry her. My wife had been dead for about 14 days at the time, but I didn't say no because I thought I needed a woman for my property. She also offered herself to me for intercourse without me even expressing any desire to do so. She grabbed me, threw me onto the hay, and that's how I had intercourse with her for the first time. I had never experienced anything like that before, a woman offering herself like that. All in all, I must have had sex with her 5 times at most. She then suggested that I talk to her father about marriage. I really thought I could marry her, so I went to old Gruber and told him that I would marry his daughter. He agreed, as did his daughter. Nevertheless, I told him that I had one condition, which was that he should no longer sleep with his daughter. He should renounce his sins, and I would then lead his daughter onto the right path. I also told him that I was a good Christian and couldn't tolerate such things. He replied that we would see. When I met his daughter again shortly afterwards, she told me that she was hopeful. She also said that I was the father. I protested and told her that her father was still there. She replied that it was better this way and that I could say, "Father, you're here too." Otherwise, he would have killed me. She also told me that her father was no longer in favor of the marriage, but that I would have to act as the father for the boy. I also spoke to old Gruber about this when I was walking home from the meadow. I asked him if he was serious about me having to act as the father. He insisted, and I immediately started with God and heaven. And when I told him I would report him, he replied that he didn't care. He then ran after me with his scythe, and I ran away. But then I went into the house to his wife and daughter while he was still in the meadow and asked them if it was really true. The 2 women insisted that I had to be the father and also told me that I had to pay. But because old Andreas Gruber was so rude and also demanded money, I said I wouldn't be the father and reported him for incest. Legal proceedings were initiated, and in the meantime, the child was born. On the 3rd day after the birth, Victoria came to me and offered to pay all the money for the paternity if I would take responsibility for the child. Since she also said that we could still get married, I finally agreed. She then brought me 2,000 marks so that I could pay the settlement to the guardianship authorities. However, the wedding never takes place because Andreas Gruber is against it. Lorenz, who has withdrawn his initial complaint, reports Andreas and Victoria again, but the case is not pursued. It is suspected that Lorenz may have committed the murders because he was angry that his complaint was not followed up and he did not want Victoria to foist a child on him. However, many months passed between the accusations and the murder, and Andreas Gruber and Lorenz Schlittenbauer had resumed a normal relationship before the crime. It is striking, however, that Lorenz continued to avoid contact with Cecilia Gruber and Victoria Gabriel, and apparently was still angry with them. This would also fit with the fact that these 2 were the most brutally murdered and had been strangled before their deaths. On March 30th, 1931, Lorenz is interrogated again in Munich. It comes up that he has no alibi, as he was keeping watch over the hay on the night of the crime and slept in the hay. This was even confirmed by his own wife. When confronted with this, Lorenz became angry and insisted that he had indeed slept at home with his wife. However, there was no one who could prove this. Nevertheless, no further investigation is conducted against Lorenz Schlittenbauer. The public prosecutor's office describes him as strange, but also says that he is harmless and helpful, and the investigation against him is dropped. What speaks against him as the perpetrator is that he offered Andreas Gruber his rifle before the crime and advised him to alert the police about the strange occurrences on the farm. This would be rather unusual behavior if he had intended to murder the family. Lorenz dies on May 22nd, 1941. In the years prior to his death, he had repeatedly sued people who called him a murderer and won every case. However, his death did not put an end to the accusations against him. his descendants were ostracized and insulted for many years to come. No one wanted anything to do with the children of the Kaifeck murderer. To this day, many people still believe he was guilty. His son reports that Lorenz cried a lot because his children were rejected because of him. He is convinced of his father's innocence. He was 30% disabled from the war, had no teeth left, and suffered from severe asthma. Because of his wheezing, he was no longer able to do heavy work. How could he have killed 6 people? A completely different theory, which has been gaining traction in recent years, is that Andreas Gruber killed his entire family and his maid himself. To examine this theory more closely, we first need to take a closer look at the hoe. The murder weapon originally belonged to Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Andreas Gruber is said to have stolen it years before the crime and modified it. A striking feature is a long screw that he attached, which was fastened with nuts at the top of the handle. At first glance, it appears to be there only to secure the tip to the handle. In fact, however, the nuts can be used to adjust how far the screw protrudes. This made it a favorite tool for Andreas Gruber to kill his pigs. The thin but unyielding screw drills precisely into the pigs' heads with even a light blow. The autopsy results of the victims also show that they were struck several times in the head with the screw. An unknown murderer who came to the farm unarmed would have had difficulty finding a suitable weapon in the first place. And then, as already mentioned, it is not easy to aim the hoe at someone's head in the dark. A stranger would probably also try to strike with the tip and not with the inconspicuous screw. Andreas Gruber, on the other hand, knew his own design perfectly and had enough practice to kill his victims with targeted blows. There were hardly any defensive wounds on the bodies, although at least Cecilia and Victoria had been strangled at first. The fact that they did not really defend themselves suggests that they knew their attacker. And the brutal manner in which they died points to a personal motive on the part of the perpetrator. Both apply to Andreas Gruber as the perpetrator. To divert attention from himself, he could have staged the strange events that occurred before the crime. Andreas Gruber had always been considered aggressive and quick-tempered. According to Lorenz Schlittenbauer's accounts, several of his children died after he locked them in the cellar and neglected them. He was also considered to be rough and brutal towards his wife Cecilia. No maid or farmhand stayed at Hinterkaifeck for long, as the pay was poor and the Grubers were considered rude and aggressive. When Victoria wanted to marry Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Andreas became angry and said that his daughter did not need any other man but him. This may have later become his motive for executing his own family. Perhaps Victoria wanted to end the relationship for good, or was planning to leave the farm. Victoria had also told Lorenz that it would be better if she were pregnant by him, as her father would otherwise kill her. When Lorenz wants to talk to him, Andreas Gruber chases him with a scythe. In the past, he has repeatedly attacked people with guns or scythes, which shows that he is quite capable of using violence. The fact that a pocket knife is considered a second murder weapon fits in with the fact that Andreas owned one. If Andreas Gruber committed the crime himself, this would also explain why the farm dog did not raise the alarm and apparently allowed the perpetrator to chain him up. In addition, Andreas would have known that he could hide the hoe in the attic under the wooden boards. A stranger would probably never have found this hiding place and would instead have burned the handle of the weapon in the bakehouse or washed the weapon and put it back. The fact that the animals were fed and watered for days after the crime would also fit with Andreas Gruber not wanting his own livestock to die. A stranger would have had little reason to do so. Andreas may have stayed at Hinterkaifeck after the crime because he didn't know where to go and because he planned to bury the bodies. But how does this theory fit with the fact that Andreas Gruber's own body was later found in the stable? It is speculated that Lorenz Schlittenbauer had already made his way to Hinterkaifeck alone to check on things. When he arrives, he meets Andreas Gruber and sees the bodies he wants to bury. Lorenz is beside himself with rage. Old Gruber killed his son Joseph and also Victoria, whom he may still have been in love with. A fight breaks out between Lorenz Schlittenbauer and Andreas Gruber, at the end of which Lorenz kills Andreas. However, Lorenz knows that no one would believe him if he said he had committed only this one murder. All the residents know that he and the Grubers had been fighting and that he had a motive to wipe out the family. He does not want to go to prison and abandon his children. Calling the police is therefore not an option for him. Instead, he goes back home and later returns with Michael Pearl and Jakob Siegel. He hopes this will give him an alibi. This would also explain why Lorenz Schlittenbauer behaved strangely after the crime, and why, years later, he reported that the perpetrator had planned to bury the bodies. Adolf Jakob Köppel has written a book about this theory. In It Was Gruber, he describes his theory of how the crime was committed. He has reconstructed the murder weapon and is convinced that only someone who was very familiar with this tool could have struck as precisely as was the case in the murder. After studying the case and all the evidence in detail, he has no doubt that Andreas Gruber himself was responsible for the crime, and that after all these years of searching, the perpetrator lies next to his victims in the family grave. I got most of the information about this theory from Adolf Köppel's book. However, going into more detail would go beyond the scope of this video. If you are interested, you will find the link to the book in the info box. Despite the many suspects, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved to this day. Numerous theories and mysteries surround the gruesome sixfold murder, and there is probably no other German case that has attracted so much attention. In recent years, many students, investigators, and medical professionals have looked into the case and tried to find new clues or even a solution. However, all attempts have been unsuccessful to date. Nevertheless, there are numerous reports and written theories about this case online and in literature. However, presenting more theories and suspects here would go beyond the scope of this video and eventually make it too confusing. But I am very excited to read your theories in the comments. Due to the outbreak of World War II, the investigation into the Hinterkaifeck case eventually came to a complete standstill, and some clues and reports were lost, which has always made it difficult to reopen the case. No new property was ever built on the site where the Hinterkaifeck farm once stood after it was demolished. Today, only a memorial stone nearby commemorates the gruesome deeds. Next to the family name, it reads, "On March 31st, 1922, the Gabriel Gruber family fell victim to godless murderers." And that brings us to the end of today's video. I think this case is less well known outside Germany. I don't think it will ever be solved, but I would be interested to hear who you think the perpetrator is. Do you think it was Andreas Gruber or Schlittenbauer? Or do you think it was perhaps someone else entirely? I did mention a few other suspects. I'm really excited to hear your comments and find out if you have any ideas other than the ones I presented in this video. Feel free to write your thoughts in the comments. This also helps support this channel. If a video gets a lot of interaction shortly after it is uploaded, it is more likely to be recommended to people who have not yet subscribed to Insolito. Remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any more videos. Otherwise, there's not much else to say. Thank you for watching, and have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching the video. I hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, bye everyone.